My parents used my name to open a restaurant for my sister, so I served them cease and desist papers. I'm Clara Whitfield, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one expected to hold everything together, while my younger sister Lydia lived like the world revolved around. Our parents, Janet and Douglas, never tried to hide that she was their favorite. Lydia was their golden girl, the star of the family. I was just the steady one in the background. Growing up, I worked part-time jobs to pay for my own thing. In high school, I bagged groceries on weekends and babysat in the evening. The money went towards school supplies, clothes, and sometimes even groceries for the house. Lydia, meanwhile, never worried about money. For her 16th birthday, my parents threw her a huge party, music, decorations, even a car wrapped in a big red bow. I remember standing off to the side, clapping like a good sister, pretending it didn't sting that I was still sharing an old car with Mom at that age. It was always like that. When Lydia wanted piano lessons, she got them. When she wanted cheerleading camp, my parents found the money. When I once asked for an art class at the community center, my dad told me it wasn't in the budget. I didn't argue. I already knew the rules. Lydia's wants were non-negotiable, mine were optional. By the time I left for college, I was used to being invisible. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to cover my tuition and rent. Lydia stayed home, drifting from one interest to another, always cushioned by my parents' support. They bragged about her constantly. Lydia's so talented. Lydia's destined for big things. When they spoke about me, it was usually to call me responsible. That word became less of a compliment and more of a cage. Even later, nothing changed. I built a life on my own, an apartment I paid for, bills I handled without asking anyone for help, while Lydia kept leaning on our parents. She was the dreamer, the one everyone catered to. I was the safety net, expected to understand and never complain. Family dinners were the hardest. Lydia would chatter on about her latest plans, some new idea or project, and my parents would hang on every word like it was gospel. If I tried to talk about my own work or things I was proud of, they'd barely react. Sometimes I'd stop mid-sentence just to see if anyone noticed. They didn't. I told myself I didn't need their approval, that I was strong enough without it. But the truth is, it hurt to always be treated like I was just there. I could accept being overlooked, but I never imagined they would go so far as to take something, not just money or opportunities, but my very name. And when that day came, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. One evening, I walked into the living room and heard low voices drifting from the kitchen. My parents and Lydia were huddled together, their tones hushed and quick. The moment they noticed me in the doorway, the conversation stopped like a door slamming shut. Lydia gave me a quick smile, too bright to be real, and my mom nervously rearranged the stack of mail on the counter. My dad just cleared his throat and asked if I had eaten dinner yet. It wasn't unusual for them to keep things from me, but the way they froze that night felt different. After that, I started noticing little things. Lydia was always on her phone, scribbling in notebooks, grinning at texts that came in. My mom would walk past her, peek over her shoulder, and nod with this proud little smile. Sometimes they'd vanish into the den together, voices carrying faintly through the door, the kind of talk that always went silent the second I got too close. When I asked what was going on, Lydia brushed me off. "Nothing you'd care about," she said once, her tone light but dismissive. My dad added, "We'll tell you when the time is right." I told myself not to think too much of it, but that dull sting in my chest was hard to ignore. A week later, they invited me over for Sunday dinner. I thought maybe that was it. Maybe they'd finally let me in on whatever they'd been plotting. The table was set neatly, the smell of roast chicken filling the air, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits. Lydia was practically glowing, leaning close to our parents, giggling at everything Dad said. I sat across from them, watching the way they moved around each other like I wasn't even there. Partway through the meal, my mom leaned back in her chair and said, "This project is going to be big. It's going to put our family name out there." She looked right at Lydia when she said it, her eyes shining. My dad nodded along, his fork tapping against his plate. Lydia smirked like she was holding on to a secret too delicious to share. I set my fork down and asked, "What project?" My mom waved her hand. "We'll tell you when everything is settled," Lydia added. "You'll see soon enough." Their voices were full of excitement, but not the kind that included me. It was the kind that made me feel like a guest in my own family. I kept chewing my food, trying to act normal, but inside, I felt that familiar burn. It was the same feeling I'd had countless times before, when Lydia got center stage and I was left to clap from the sideline. The way they were all looking at each other, whispering about how wonderful it was going to be, made me feel like an outsider at my own family's table. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I'd been through this before. Big promises, big plans, all centered around Lydia. Maybe it was another hobby she was chasing, or some new scheme they wanted to finance. It hurt, sure, but it wasn't new. I swallowed it down, convincing myself that this was just one more thing I wasn't supposed to be part of. But a small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that this time was different. I didn't know how yet, but the way they shut me out felt heavier, more deliberate. I tried to ignore that feeling, but deep down, I knew something was coming. Something I wasn't going to be able to brush off as easily as before. I was at work when one of my coworkers stopped by my desk with a big grin. "Congratulations, Clara," he said. I looked up, confused. "For what?" He laughed like I was joking. "For your restaurant. I drove by it last night. Place looks great. Whitfield's Kitchen, right? Bold move putting your name on the front." I froze. My name? I had no idea what he was talking about. I forced a smile and nodded just enough to end the conversation, but my hands were trembling. The moment my shift ended, I grabbed my keys and drove across town. It didn't take long to find it. There it was, sitting on the corner of Main Street. A brand new restaurant with a shiny black sign that read Whitfield's Kitchen in big gold letters. My last name, bold and unavoidable, plastered across the front like it belonged to someone else. My stomach twisted as I parked and walked up to the building. Through the glass, I could see people inside. Staff in matching uniforms rushed between tables, and in the center of it all was Lydia, smiling like a queen holding court. She wore a crisp white blazer, her hair styled like she was posing for a magazine cover. Every laugh, every gesture made her look like she was the star of the show. My starstruck little sister, playing owner of a restaurant, with my name lighting up the front. I stepped inside. The place smelled of garlic and fresh bread, warm and inviting. But all I could think about was that name. My name, printed on the menus stacked by the door, embroidered on the aprons the servers wore, even painted across the wall behind the counter. Whitfield's Kitchen. It felt like I'd walked into some twisted version of myself, a life I didn't choose but was suddenly tied to. I sat down at the bar and asked the bartender who owned the place. Without hesitation, he said, "Oh, Lydia Whitfield. She's the face of it all. But get this, the business license is under her sister's name. Clever, right? Makes it feel more established." He chuckled, sliding a drink to a customer. I didn't laugh. My chest tightened. I pulled out my phone and searched public business records right there. Sure enough, the LLC was filed under my full legal name, Clara Elaine Whitfield. My name wasn't just on the sign. It was on the paperwork, the contracts, the very foundation of the restaurant. It was like they'd ripped my identity out of me and stamped it on something I had nothing to do with. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at Lydia across the room as she greeted a group of guests, posing for photos like she was a celebrity. She looked radiant, proud, like this was the best night of her life. And I was the invisible shadow, the unwilling sacrifice, the name she had stolen to make herself look legitimate. It wasn't favoritism anymore. It was theft. The next evening I walked back into the restaurant, this time with a clear purpose. From the moment I opened the door, my name was everywhere. Whitfield's Kitchen glowed on the sign outside, echoed on the menus stacked neatly by the host's stand, stitched into the uniforms of the servers hurrying from table to table. Even the wall art carried my name, painted in sweeping letters like it belonged to someone else. The sight made my skin crawl. I spotted Lydia near the back, chatting with a couple of customers as if she were some kind of celebrity. She was soaking in the attention, smiling and tossing her hair like she had been running the place for years. I walked straight toward her, each step heavier than the last. When she finally noticed me, her smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened like she had been expecting me. "Clara," she said sweetly, sliding a hand onto her hip. "So glad you came to see your restaurant." I didn't return her smile. "Why is my name on all of this? Why is the business in my name?" She tilted her head and smirked, like my anger was amusing. "Relax, Clara. It's not like you were using it. Besides, our name has a nice ring to it. People trust it. It makes the place sound established." I stared at her in disbelief. "You took my identity, Lyd. You didn't ask. You didn't even tell me. You just stole it." Before she could answer, I heard my parents' voices. I turned and saw Mom and Dad walking toward us, both wearing proud smiles. My mom reached out and touched my arm like she was trying to calm me down. "Clara, honey, don't make this into a big deal. This is for the family. It's all of us together, leaving a legacy." "For the family?" My voice shook. "You mean for Lydia? You built this entire place around her, and you used my name to make it happen." Dad frowned, as though I was being unreasonable. "It's still the Whitfield name. Yours, ours, hers. It's all the same. You should be proud your name is out there. People will see it and think of success. Isn't that what matters?" I looked at the three of them, standing together like a wall I could never break through. Lydia still wore that smug little smile, the one that told me she'd already won this battle in her mind. Mom and Dad were nodding, trying to convince me that I should see this theft as some kind of honor. But all I felt was hollow, like they had taken the last piece of me I had left. This wasn't favoritism anymore. It wasn't just spoiling Lydia while expecting me to pick up the slack. This was my name, my identity, stripped away and handed to her like it was theirs to give. They tried to disguise it as family loyalty, as something we should all be proud of, but I saw it for what it was. It was theft, plain and simple. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The streetlights blurred past, but I barely noticed them. My chest was heavy, my thoughts loud, looping over the sight of my name plastered on that restaurant. My name was no longer mine. It had been taken and dressed up as if it belonged to Lydia. The anger burned, but beneath it was something colder, something that had been there for years. As I parked and sat in the quiet of my apartment, old memories came rushing back without invitation. I remembered the day Lydia turned 16. The driveway was filled with balloons, music blasted from rented speakers, and her friends screamed when they saw the silver car waiting for her with a bow on top. My parents were glowing with pride, hugging her like she had just won something remarkable. I clapped from the sidelines, pretending not to care, though my heart sank. That same week, I was still waking up early to catch the bus, rain or shine. Nobody thought about how unfair it was, not even for a moment. Another memory surfaced, our graduations. Lydia's was celebrated in a rented hall with decorations, speeches, and endless praise. People lined up to hug her, to tell her how bright her future looked. Mine was a small gathering in our kitchen, a plain cake on the counter, relatives chatting about other things. When I tried to hide my disappointment, Dad patted my shoulder and told me, "Not everything has to be a show." But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the show. It was about who they thought deserved one. Those moments had stacked up over the years, leaving me with a quiet ache that never fully went away. I had always been the background, the steady one, the responsible one who needed less. They had trained me to believe it was selfish to want more. And so I had stayed silent, again and again, watching as Lydia was celebrated, and I was expected to endure. But this was different. This wasn't them forgetting to praise me, or brushing past my achievements. This was them taking something that was mine, and using it without a second thought. My name, my identity. They hadn't asked, hadn't even warned me. They acted as if it was theirs to hand over, like I didn't matter at all. The more I thought about it, the sharper the betrayal felt. My throat ached like I had swallowed glass. I kept seeing the proud look on Lydia's face, the calm assurance in my parents' voices as they defended her. They weren't sorry. They didn't even think they'd done anything wrong. To them, it was all for the family. To me, it was proof I had never truly belonged in it the way Lydia did. Sitting there, I realized I couldn't keep letting them write the story for me. I couldn't keep shrinking back, pretending it didn't matter. Something inside me hardened that night. They had crossed a line they couldn't take back. I knew I had to act. I spent the night pacing around my apartment, the papers I had printed spread out on the couch. Every time I looked at them, my chest tightened. My full name was stamped across documents that tied me to something I had never agreed to. The thought of letting it go made me feel sick, but facing my own family over it felt heavier than anything I had ever done. By the next morning, I knew I needed help. I searched for attorneys in town and found one who specialized in business law. That's how I ended up sitting in the office of Marissa Doyle. She was sharp and direct, with the kind of presence that immediately put me on edge and at ease all at once. She skimmed through the papers I handed her, flipping pages quickly, her brow tightening as she read. Finally, she set them down and looked me straight in the eye. "So your sister and your parents opened a restaurant, filed everything under your legal name, and you didn't sign a single thing?" I shook my head. "No. I didn't even know it existed until someone congratulated me at work. I've had no say in any of this." Marissa leaned back in her chair. "Then they can't do this. Not legally. Your name belongs to you. They can't use it for business without your permission. This isn't just bad judgment. It's a violation of your rights." Her words made something in me unclench. For the first time since I'd walked into that restaurant, I felt like I wasn't losing my mind. Still, guilt weighed heavily in my voice. "But they're my family. If I fight this, it'll destroy what little we have left." "I understand that," Marissa said gently, though her tone stayed firm. "But you need to understand something too. If you allow this, they're not just taking your name, they're tying you to their business. If it fails, if debts pile up, if anything shady happens, it's your name on every piece of paper. Do you really want that?" The image of my credit, my reputation, even my future being dragged down by Lydia's project made me cold all over. "No," I whispered. "Then here's what we do," Marissa said, sliding a blank form across the desk. "We start with a cease and desist letter. It's not a lawsuit. It's a formal demand for them to stop using your name. If they ignore it, we escalate legally. But this first step draws the line. It forces them to acknowledge what they've done." I stared at the page, my throat tight. On the surface, it was just a letter. But I knew it was more than that. It was me choosing to stand up to them, knowing it would change everything. The guilt pressed hard. whispering that I was betraying them. My parents always preached that family stuck together, no matter what. To them, silence equaled loyalty. But beneath that guilt, another feeling stirred, something steadier, stronger. It felt like the ground beneath me finally firmed up after years of giving way. I lifted my head, meeting Marissa's steady gaze. My hands were still shaking, but my voice was clear. Write it up. I'm ready. The restaurant was buzzing when I pushed open the door. The dinner rush had filled every table, voices rising in conversation, glasses clinking and servers darting between the aisles. The smell of roasted garlic and butter hung in the air, but I barely noticed it. My hand tightened around the envelope in my bag, the letter inside heavy with everything it meant. I walked straight through the room. Conversations dipped as people glanced up, some curious, some irritated at being distracted from their meals. I ignored them. My eyes were locked on Lydia, who stood near the bar laughing with a couple of customers. She looked completely in her element, glowing under the soft lights, like the restaurant had been built just to showcase her. When she saw me, her smile faltered. I didn't waste time. I pulled the envelope out and placed it firmly in her hand. You need to read this, I said. Confusion flickered across her face as she tore the envelope open. She scanned the letter quickly, and her expression shifted. First disbelief, then shock, and finally something colder. Her cheeks flushed as she realized what she was holding. For the first time, she didn't look smug. A hush fell over the tables closest to us. Diners leaned in, forks hovering midair, waiting to see what was happening. Lydia's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence dragged until my mother's voice cut through it like a knife. Janet appeared at Lydia's side, eyes blazing as she snatched the letter from her. She skimmed it, her face hardening with every line. Then she looked at me, her voice sharp enough to turn heads across the room. You're tearing this family apart. Every head in the restaurant seemed to swivel toward me. The weight of all those eyes pressed down, but I didn't flinch. My voice stayed steady, even as my heart hammered inside my chest. No, I said, meeting her stare. You did that when you stole my name. The words seemed to echo, hanging in the charged air. Lydia stood frozen, the papers trembling slightly in her hand. My dad, who had been sitting at a corner table, rose slowly and made his way over, his jaw tight. But for once, he didn't rush to smooth things over. He just looked between us, silent, as though even he couldn't defend what they had done. The restaurant had gone nearly quiet now, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation replaced by whispers and stolen glances. I could feel the tension crawling over the room, but I didn't back down. My parents had spent years teaching me to swallow my hurt, to step aside so Lydia could shine. Not this time. Lydia finally tried to speak, her voice shaking. Clara, you can't be serious. I cut her off. I'm completely serious. That letter is only the beginning if you don't stop using my name. I turned before anyone else could answer, walking out under the stares of strangers and the furious silence of my family. My hands were still trembling, but my steps were steady. For the first time, I felt like the ground belonged to me. The phone call started the very next morning. First it was my aunt, her voice sharp before I could even say hello. She called me selfish, said families were supposed to lift each other up, not drag each other down. She didn't ask why I had done it, didn't want to hear my side. She only wanted to scold. By the afternoon, more relatives had joined in. Cousins, uncles. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years left messages that dripped with judgment. Words like heartless, jealous, and ungrateful came up again and again. It was as if they had all agreed on the same script. None of them cared that my name had been taken without my consent. All they saw was that I had dared to stand up to my parents and sister. The hardest blow came from Lydia. She showed up outside my apartment, eyes red, a storm of anger and tears mixed together. She didn't knock gently, she pounded, forcing me to open the door. The moment I did, she burst out. You're ruining my dream. Do you even care what this means to me? I stayed quiet for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. She was shaking, her voice breaking, but underneath the desperation was the same entitlement I had seen my whole life. Finally, I answered, steady but low. It's not your dream if you had to steal my name to make it real. Her face twisted, and for a second, I thought she might actually slap me. Instead, she let out a bitter laugh. You've always hated me. Admit it. You could never stand to see me happy. That cut deep, but I didn't let it show. I simply said, I won't let myself be erased anymore. Not by you, not by anyone. Then I closed the door on her for the first time in my life. My hands trembled afterward, but I didn't regret it. Later that week, I sat across from Marissa again. I told her everything, the calls, the accusations, Lydia's outburst. For the first time since this began, my voice cracked. They all think I'm cruel, like I'm punishing them just for existing. And part of me feels awful, like maybe I really did go too far. Marissa shook her head firmly. No, Clara, protecting yourself isn't cruelty, it's survival. If you had let this go, you'd be tied to their choices forever. This isn't about jealousy. It's about your right to your own life, your own name. That's not negotiable. Her words sank in, steadier than my own doubts. For the first time since the backlash began, I felt a flicker of calm. I wasn't destroying my family. They had made their choices. I was finally making mine. The letter worked faster than I thought it would. Within a week, Marissa followed up with more paperwork, and the pressure started to close in on Lydia. She could no longer hide behind my name, not when every legal notice made it clear that continuing would mean serious consequence. What had once looked like a shiny new business began to crack. Investors were the first to pull out. They had backed the restaurant because the Whitfield name carried weight in town. But once they realized it wasn't really Lydia's to use, they wanted nothing to do with it. One by one, they withdrew their support, taking their money with them. Without funding, the restaurant's shine started to fade. Suppliers followed. Some refused to deliver orders, not wanting to be tied up in a messy dispute. Others raised their prices, nervous about whether they'd even get paid. Slowly, the flow of food and wine that kept the place alive dried up. The menu shrank, corners were cut, and the service slipped. Customers noticed. Word spread quickly that Whitfield's kitchen wasn't what it had promised to be. The same diners who once waited eagerly for a table now chose other places. Through it all, my parents finally came to me. I found them waiting outside my apartment one evening, both looking more worn than I'd ever seen them. My mother's voice broke as soon as she spoke. "Clara, please. You have to stop this. Lydia's future is at stake. Everything she's worked for is crumbling. Don't do this to her." I stared at them, and for a moment, part of me wanted to give in. They looked so small, so desperate. But then I remembered the way they had looked at me in that restaurant, like I was nothing more than an obstacle in Lydia's path. I remembered every time they had chosen her over me, no matter the cost. My father tried next, his tone softer but still insistent. "She's your sister. Family should come first. This will ruin her if you don't reconsider." The guilt pressed hard, but it didn't win this time. I took a deep breath, my voice steady as I answered. "My future was never your concern. Now I'm making it mine." The silence that followed was heavy. My parents exchanged a look, one filled with disappointment, but also something like resignation. They finally seemed to understand that I wasn't going to bend. For once, they couldn't guilt me back into the shadows. They left without another word, and I stood in the doorway long after they were gone. The restaurant was collapsing, and Lydia's dream was slipping away, but I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. For the first time, I wasn't fighting for scraps of their approval. I was standing for myself. The restaurant didn't last long after that. Without investors, without steady suppliers, and without the shine of my name to draw people in, Whitfield's kitchen went quiet. Tables sat empty, the parking lot barren where it had once been packed. Within months, the lights shut off for good, the front windows papered over with a dull for lease sign. What had been my family's proud project ended as another failed business on Main Street. I heard about the closure not from my parents, but through a neighbor who mentioned it in passing. My parents didn't call me, didn't stop by, didn't even try to explain. They had made their choice. Janet and Douglas stood firmly by Lydia's side, pouring what was left of themselves into her, even as the dream unraveled. And in return, they cut me out. Calls stopped, invitations never came, holidays passed in silence. I became the daughter they pretended not to have. It hurt, of course. There were nights when I sat awake wondering if I should have done something differently, wondering if I could have saved both myself. But then I remembered the truth. There had never been room for me in their version of family. My role had always been to step aside so Lydia could shine. This time I refused. The distance was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time in my life, I didn't wake up measuring myself against Lydia or chasing after crumbs of approval that never came. I started to think about what I wanted, not what would keep the peace. The silence from them created space for me to finally hear my own voice. I walked past the empty shell of the restaurant one evening, the sign still faintly visible where my name used to hang in bold letters. For a moment, I stood there staring at it, remembering the shock, the anger, the betrayal. But instead of bitterness, a strange calm washed over me. They had tried to claim my identity as their foundation, to build something by erasing me. And yet, I was still standing. In the end, I hadn't lost anything that truly belonged to me. What I gained was far greater, the courage to claim my own future, without them deciding what it should be. They tried to build a future by stealing my name. But in the end, I was the one who reclaimed it.